Okay, wonderful. So, as has already been said, my topic is about the rise of embalming in the United States directly because of the American Civil War. I know we already talked about me a little bit, but a little bit more. I'm a 29-year-old enthusiast about all things death. I'm a patron of the Order of the Good Death. If you don't know about it, it is fantastic. Go watch Ask a Mortician on YouTube. Caitlin Doty has an amazing, amazing treasure trove and community of all things death and funeral related. It is fantastic. I'm self-taught. I must say that I am not an embalmer. I'm not a mortician. I'm not a historian. This is all research that I have done on my own, books that I have read, and just my own experience and views on this. My sibling who is here is also a horror fan, and they run a diversity horror blog under the same name, Diversity Horror. They work in pathology. We are half Black. My dad is Black and he is a doctor. We come from a long line of doctors. 3 out of 4 of my grandparents were doctors. So I am very interested in this subject, both from a medical and scientific perspective, as well as a personal perspective, as someone who is directly descended from a slave. Black people in the United States have been marginalized for the entirety of this nation's history. And so this is a very important subject to me. So I'll be going and touching on a little bit of Black history in this as well. A note, I will be trying to avoid using gendered language as best I can in regards to large groups of people. Generally in history books and textbooks and stuff, they'll say like, the men, the soldiers who are all men. I will be saying people instead, just because I don't want to generalize. Before we get into the meat of it, but I do have to say a content warning, just to cover my bases. This presentation has actual historic photographs of deceased persons, contains graphic medical descriptions and language, and is otherwise not recommended for persons who may be uncomfortable with the topic of death and cadavers. I'm assuming most of you already are okay with this because this entire month's theme is death, but just in case. So to start us off, I want to talk about numbers in the Civil War. This was the largest American catastrophe in our nation's history. 620,000 people died due to casualties or disease. To put it in perspective, that's 2% of the entire population, which would have been about 6 million people today dying in a 4-year period. Comparing it to the American losses of World War II, that was only 405,399 people, which was only 0.3% of the population of the United States in 1941. So it is a huge, huge number of losses. And I'll continue to be making that point that it is hard to fathom how big of a loss this was for many American families. Since people in the United States had never been so fully exposed to the horrors of war before, they were really forced to fully confront death on a mass scale. No one had ever needed to create mass graves or deal with mass death before. It was unprecedented. Like, horrors of warfare were brought home for the first time via photography. It was becoming more accessible and more commonplace. Cameras were still heavy and bulky, but people were able to transport them, which is the key point there, that they were transportable, so they could document for the first time what war was and how it was and the horrors of it through photographic documentation. It really smashed the romantic views of war that people had previously with like the Revolutionary War, for example, or even the War of 1812, where you had like people in formations on either side and there were proper rules of battle, etc. The Civil War ended in trench warfare, which is really the start marker of what modern warfare is today. It would never be the same. World War I was the first full war in trench warfare. And it just points to how horrific the Civil War really was. It is hard to conceptualize how difficult, like how big the shift was for American citizens at the time, because Today, we have like news, videos, photos at our fingertips. We can scroll through Twitter, go on Instagram, see live videos. We can watch real time what's going on in Ukraine. And in some senses, we have become desensitized to the horrors of war because we get inundated our entire lives through news and media. But people in the 1860s were really the first to bear witness to the battlefield. Another shift that occurred due to this aftermath was the emotional need for closure. Because the entire country was in mourning, their relationship with death completely changed, and so many people weren't even able to have remains or bodies left to mourn over and to grieve. And so they had to figure out other ways. One of the ways that people did that, which could be an entire different presentation, is spiritualism, which included like spirit photography, seances, mediums, and all of that sort of stuff, to communicate with the dead who were lost and be able to reach that sort of closure. There are a couple other ways people did that, but today we are focusing on the physical aspect of getting closure, which is bringing the deceased home for burial. My last point about this, I just cannot stress enough how vast the casualties were during the American Civil War. Bodies were littered all over battlefields. This quote really paints a pretty good picture of that, and so I wanted to read it for you. There were no national cemeteries, no burial details, and no messengers of loss. The largest human catastrophe in American history, the Civil War forced the young nation to confront death and destruction in a way that has not been equaled before or since. From the American Battlefield Trust. So, as often with war, necessity is the mother of invention, and sometimes quoted as war breeds innovation, which is not entirely false. A direct result of the Civil War was the early Gatling gun, or the repeating rifle, which was a precursor to the modern machine gun. Telegraphs, railway travel, and submarines were all new innovations that were used in the Civil War. Confederate armies even used air balloons for air travel to spy on enemy troops or Union troops during the war, and that had also never happened before. Abraham Lincoln was able to send a telegraph directly to troops on the front line, resulting in an entire new way of communication with soldiers. It was just unprecedented, all of the amount of science and innovation that came out because of war. A more recent example of this sort of thing is the Manhattan Project in the United States, which my grandmother worked on. That brought nuclear power to the world, and that's something that's still in use today. So in the same vein, people needed a solution for the ever-growing number of corpses, and a way to meet that demand of mourning families 100 miles away was embalming. About 40,000 people of the 600 or so thousand casualties were embalmed, and it's a small number just because it was difficult to identify individuals. There were no dog tags, there were no other ways of identifying remains, especially if there were even enough remains left to identify. It was more common among Northern families to pay for embalming just because they could afford it. After the Civil War, the South sustained heavy financial losses. Men who could work died. They were the main source. They were people who were bringing home their main source of income. There were no more slaves to provide free labor. And the North seized a bunch of assets from the South. So they were left impoverished. Unfortunately, this is a loss that can still be seen today in the American South with a lower education and literacy rate. According to a recent US census, the Southern United States had the lowest educational attainment at every level, despite having by far the largest population of any other US region. The prices of embalming were about $30 to $80 at the time, which is approximately $540 to $900 today. It's not far off from the current $750 average price tag for embalming, but it would still be a small fortune for a struggling family who had lost everything, especially in the South. Profiteers quickly caught on to the embalming during the American Civil War, and the American War Department was forced to issue General Order 39 to ensure that only properly licensed embalmers could offer their services to mourners. Unfortunately, around this time, and it's not unique to the United States, a lot of people sought to profit off of loss and death, especially when there were more science things involved. Embalmers were not all well liked by those on the battlefield. In January 1865, General Ulysses S. Grant withdrew embalmers' permits and ordered them beyond the lines to stop affecting morale. Some embalmers went as far as embalming a corpse and then holding it hostage from the family until the grieving family paid. One of the most notable examples of embalming in the United States is Abraham Lincoln. In 1861, Colonel Elmer Ellsworth was shot while removing a Confederate flag from the roof of a Virginian hotel. He was a close friend of the then President Abraham Lincoln. Another man, Thomas Holmes, often considered the man of modern embalming, offered his services to the bereft family and his friends. He was then appointed to be an embalmer on a national scale and went on to embalm approximately 4,000 bodies at $100 a corpse, which is a little bit higher than the average $30 to $80 that we mentioned previously. Crowds came to view Ellsworth's remain, and the nation was newly exposed to embalming. Not very far later, Abraham Lincoln had his son embalmed after he died in 1862 from typhoid, which was also ravaging the country at the time. Abraham Lincoln then himself was embalmed by the same man, Henry P. Cattell, and put on tour around the United States. And if we learn anything from heads of state, like Queen Victoria, for example, it's that they have a very big impact on culture and perceptions at the time. Abraham Lincoln's body went on a 1,654-mile, 13-day journey by train to Springfield, Illinois, which was his hometown. I also included a snippet from a newspaper called the Chicago Tribune regarding this travel and someone who went to go see him. It's hard to read on there, so I'll read it for you. It says, appearance of the late president. The president was neatly dressed in a suit of black. His face was somewhat discolored, as might have been expected from the character of his wound, but not more than we remember to have seen in cases of gunshot wounds. Otherwise, his countenance exhibited an extremely natural and lifelike appearance, more as if calmly slumbering than in the cold embrace of death. It did not require a vivid imagination to discover a placid smile resting upon that marble face. Chicago Tribune, 1865. This photo is also the only known image of Abraham Lincoln after his embalming in an open coffin. I do want to point out that the language in this article, the calmly slumbering and placid smile, helped to perpetuate the beautification of death, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. So before we get into it, what is embalming? Embalming is the process of preservation of human remains to delay decomposition. Mummification is a type of embalming. It was a very early method of embalming, but embalming is not necessarily mummification. The main distinction is that mummification involves the drying out of flesh and remains, where embalming often is an attempt to preserve the deceased as they were at the time of death. Both aim to stall or stop decomposition taking place. The photo is of a Chinchorro mummy, which are the oldest known mummies at the moment, and they date back to 5,000 to 6,000 BCE. Modern embalming, as we know it now, or arterial embalming, started to rise in popularity in the early 1800s. In 1838, the French chemist Jean Ganal introduced a new method for preserving human remains in which arsenic was injected directly into the carotid artery. Thomas Holmes, who I mentioned previously, studied at Columbia University, went on to become a huge embalmer in the United States. And embalming previous to this had been available, but it was used mostly to preserve a cadaver for anatomical study or scientific study, but the Civil War cemented its popularity as a means of transporting bodies home. Pushback against embalming at the time. Before the Civil War, most Americans felt that the ancient practice of preserving bodies after death was a distasteful pagan custom. It was viewed as mutilating the deceased. There was also pushback against cremation when that became popular, and there's modern day pushback against composting and aquamation. So with each step in furthering funerary practices, there has always been pushback. The future of embalming. Cryogenics, while it's not currently possible, you can get frozen and then maybe in the future, one day they'll figure out how to resuscitate you. Could be an option. Currently, arterial embalming is still the main method of embalming, although it is declining in popularity, and I personally hope that the number will continue to dwindle. So before we get into the process of embalming, we need to talk about decomposition. According to Dr. Arpnad A. Vas, a senior staff scientist at Oak Ridge National Laboratory and adjunct associate professor at the University of Tennessee in forensic anthropology, human decomposition begins around 4 minutes after a person dies. And I got that information off of the Biohazard and Trauma Removal Services info sheet about human decomposition in the United States. So there's about 4 steps in decomposition after being alive. And the first, autolysis, happens approximately 4 minutes after death, like we mentioned, also known as self-digestion. As soon as the blood circulation and respiration stop, the body has no way of getting oxygen or removing wastes. Excess carbon dioxide causes an acidic environment, causing membranes in cells to rupture. The membranes release enzymes that begin eating the cells from the inside out. Rigor mortis causes stiffening. Small blisters filled with nutrient-rich fluid begin appearing on the internal organs and the skin's surface. The body will appear to have a sheen due to ruptured blisters, and the skin's top layer will begin to loosen. Setting the features generally must happen before rigor mortis sets in, ideally. However, morticians can massage the body back into a more pleasant position, which I'm sure they did in the Civil War, because you can't, if people are dying on the battlefield, you can't get to them before rigor mortis sets in. The next stage is bloat, which happens 3 to 5 days after death. Leaked enzymes from the first stage begin producing a bunch of gases. This sulfur-containing compounds that the bacteria release also cause the skin discoloration. And that's when you start getting the lovely green and blue hues. Due to the gases, the human body can double in size. In addition, insect activity can be present. The microorganisms and bacteria produce extremely unpleasant odors called putrefaction. These odors often alert others that a person has died and can linger long after a body has been removed. The third step is active decay, which happens around 8 to 10 days after death. Fluids released through the orifices indicate the beginning of active decay, or the body begins to liquefy. Organs, muscles, and skin become liquefied. When all the body's soft tissue decomposes, hair, bones, cartilage, and other byproducts of decay remain. The cadaver loses most mass during this stage. I will also mention that decomposition can happen at different times as well, depending on the environment. There are a lot of different outside factors that affect decomposition. Obviously, there are natural mummies, so decomposition doesn't take place. But if you are in a more tropical environment, it can happen faster. If you are in a more arid environment, it can slow the process down. The final step is skeletonization. It happens about 1 month after death. The skeleton has the decomposition rate based on the loss of organic and inorganic components. So there's no set time frame when skeletonization occurs. So now we've covered decomposition, we can get into the process of how embalming works. Each embalmer generally has a secret formula that is varied in success of embalming and duration of the embalming. It's made up of a bunch of different chemicals, which we'll get to. But the way they do it is first they need to remove the liquids from the body via an artery. Gases and fluids are also removed from body cavities and soft organs with the use of an aspirator and a trocar. To replace the fluid, the embalmer needed to use an aneurysm hook or needle and insert it into an arterial tube. The photo depicts a silk arterial tube being used that has been placed up under her arm or their arm. And this allows a vacuum to take place where they pump out the old blood through the drain tube and allow chemicals to take its place by using like a hand-operated bulb syringe or a vacuum pump. In modern day embalming, they have an automated machine that will do that for you, so you don't have to sit there like pumping your little machine. Depending on the embalmer, they would utilize makeups and wax to either reconstruct parts of the face if they were missing or scarred or disfigured, or to give the deceased a more natural complexion, i.e. that of a living person, and just to make them look more presentable. This is also including setting the features, like the jaw is often slacked, the eyes will be open in a regular corpse, but those can be kind of horrific for people to see. So they wanted to make them look like they're in a sleeping position. So they kept the jaw closed and then they keep the eyes shut. One of the other reasons that embalming grew in popularity during this time is because they believed it sanitized the body, because there were sanitation concerns and people didn't know how diseases and viruses were transmitted, and so they thought that they could catch illnesses from being around the deceased. So obviously we know that's not true now, but so quickly mention the tools. Here are some photos of them. There are not that many extant examples of Civil War era embalming instruments. These particular 3 photos are. But most of the tools haven't changed much since the Civil War, and most of them are pretty much the same. So first we have the trocar, which is on the bottom left. It is a long, thin metal instrument with a needle, a sharp needle, and it is hollow on the inside. And the top metal piece in the photo is a tube that would be inserted over the trocar. And so once you were able to put the trocar in, you could remove the trocar, the tube would stay in place, and you were able to pump out whatever fun gooey things you needed to. The trocar is generally inserted into the abdominal cavity up, and then pushed around in a fan-like motion to sort of pierce all the organs and make sure that they're able to get all of the delicious gooey bits inside. Next is the bulb syringe. It looks like a basting syringe that you would use for like a turkey or a chicken. That is on the top right in the red box. It's got a like rubber bulb on the end, and it's just a glass syringe that they would use and just sit there pumping the chemicals through the arterial network. And the last photo is a aneurysm needle. It is a small, thin, hooked metal needle that they would insert in the artery to get it open so they could insert the arterial tubes and drainage tubes. And finally, embalming fluids. So the photo here I have is from the ERA formulary in 1893 and has a couple of different recipes for embalming fluid. I do have to say that if you do try this at home, it is not recommended, but you can try it at home should you wish to. Arsenic-based solutions were the most common in use at the time for embalming fluids. The amount of arsenic ranged from about 2 ounces to 12 pounds, depending on the recipe and depending on the embalmer. It declined in use when embalmers realized that it was contributing to their premature deaths. But it was widely used for a number of things in the Victorian period, as well as like arsenic wallpaper, arsenic fabric dye, because it gave that lovely green color. You could get arsenic pills to make your complexion look better. It was a very, very popular drug at the time, but thankfully it declined in use when people realized how bad it was. You can get abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, cancer, and more from arsenic poisoning. So it is not recommended that you either ingest or are exposed to arsenic in any capacity. Another fun fact about arsenic is that Civil War cemeteries in modern day, if there are too many embalmed bodies there which contain arsenic, the arsenic can leak into the water sources in nearby towns, because arsenic does not break down. So it stays in the ground, it stays in the water. It's not a fun time. um, I mentioned a little bit earlier that embalming was in part to sanitize the body after death, since many believe that illnesses could be transferred by being near a corpse. And then formaldehyde, which is what many people know as being used as an embalming fluid, didn't come into common use until the 1890s. And the German chemist August Wilhelm von Hofmann discovered formaldehyde and noted its preservative properties not until 1867. So that's quite a bit after the Civil War, which ended in about 1865. So some of the chemicals that were used in some of these embalming formulas, which absolutely varied until they were written down from like this journal in 1893, sodium chloride, which we know is salt, just regular table salt, aluminum sulfate, a coagulating agent, also a type of salt, chlorinated lime, which is a bleaching powder that you can just get on Amazon, and caustic soda, otherwise known as lye. And it gives you all of the measurements you need for that to make your own DIY embalming fluid. So after the body is embalmed, you need to go through the process of getting it back to the family. A number of Union soldiers or their families would prepay for embalming services and shipment back north in the event of a soldier's death. Railways made this possible. I mentioned the advancement of technologies during the Civil War. Trains were becoming in common use, especially in the north. And so that made it possible to be able to ship multiple bodies home, and people would wait at train stations to see if their loved ones would return. You'd have to decide if you wanted to put them in a coffin or a casket. A coffin, which is depicted in the photo, is the box with the 6 sides with the tapered edge. They're the traditional shaped wooden vessels, and they were the most common option leading up to this period. However, caskets started to gain in popularity with the rise of the funeral industry due to the Civil War. Modern funeral directors may mention preserving the dignity of the deceased by way of a fancy death box for them to be buried in, aka a casket. Caskets allowed more beautification in death. The silk linings, the pillows, the metal embellishments, all the fancy decorations, all contribute to the grandeur of funeral services. The word casket itself lends itself to thinking of a container for treasure, although that was more common historically, because nowadays when we say casket, we most often think of a vessel for the deceased. Early caskets were sometimes still 6-sided, but gradually lost the taper and became of that more rectangular, boxy shape that we know of today. New types of caskets were also being developed, especially when getting shipped, that they had like windows in them, viewing windows, and all sorts of doodads and add-ons that you could get. Wakes and viewings. So having a casket helped make a wake or a viewing more presentable or less scary or confrontational. It made it look like the person was just sleeping comfortably in their fluffy casket rather than a very stark wooden box. Viewing the deceased is also just an important step in people's grief. It is for me personally, but we have refrigeration nowadays to make that possible. So you can have viewings without the need of embalming. At the time, they didn't really have the choice. So the important thing to note here is that embalming during this period allowed people that choice. So they could have those final viewings, they could have those final goodbyes and closure that they needed in order to move on with their grief. Because previously they weren't able to have that. Sometimes there were still hiccups along the way. Occasionally the body would already be fully decomposed when it got home, which would be horrific for everyone involved. Or it could be the wrong person entirely. I already mentioned that new types of caskets were developed, and one of them included a viewing window so people could easily see inside the box without having to open it and then be shocked and horrified to find that it is not your son, Johnny, who had went off to the war. I want to take a moment here to mention a embalmer of note. Prince Greer was noted as the first embalmer of color in the United States. Black soldiers in the war were recruited to bury the dead and keep records of burial sites for soldiers killed in combat. They also became assistants to doctors and were trained in embalming and conducted much of the work on the battlefield or around battle sites. Prince Greer was a soldier he was a slave to a Confederate cavalry officer who was killed in action. And the story goes that Greer took it upon himself to return the body of his former master to his estate and contacted a Nashville undertaker, Dr. W.P. Cornelius, to help him in this endeavor. Cornelius embalmed the officer and his body was shipped back to Texas. But during this time, Cornelius's current assistant, a Dr. Lewis, decided that embalming was not quite the job he wanted. Upon the departure of Lewis, Prince Greer stepped forward and offered to learn the embalming trade in exchange for room and board. We don't actually know if we have any extant photos of him. This is a supposed photo of Prince Greer, and there really isn't a whole lot of information about it because the lives and going-ons of Black people at this time weren't really recorded because the white people who were doing the recording didn't think it was necessary. So we sort of lose track of what happened to him after that. We don't have any records of descendants or if he continued on the practice somewhere else. But at least we do have some record of him via Dr. Cornelius's journals and writings. So thankfully we have that little piece of information. So back to funerals. Wanted to touch on the Victorian influences in America at the time and how that also morphed the funeral industry into what we know of it as today. One of the factors was cadavers. Cadavers were in big demand in the 1800s for Victorian medicine. The Butchering Art by Lindsay Fitzharris is a wonderful book outlining the advancements in science and medicine, the use of bodies becoming more normal in the early to mid 1800s. Having ready access to these cadavers meant more opportunity for experimentation and development of techniques in surgery. The two main actors in this are Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, who both contributed leaps and bounds to germ theory. So obviously they didn't really help as much in embalming, but their work helped naturalize the use of cadavers for study, which obviously needed to be proved vital to normalizing embalming so people could study the RTO on that work and be able to understand how it worked. The other side of this coin is popular culture. So I could do another entire long presentation just on Victorian mourning culture and traditions. Death was a common part of people's lives over in the United Kingdom and in the United States. With the age of industrialization over in London, urban areas boomed in population. It came with food shortages, labor incidents, sickness. The cholera pump is a great example. So mourning just became part of people's lives. It became people's fashions, photographs, household customs, and more. Despite the United States declaring independence from the United Kingdom barely 100 years prior, Queen Victoria was still wildly influential to citizens of the United States. The American citizens tried to take some of those cultures and make them their own. So while taking the silhouettes or styles, would use American textiles instead and tried to make everything distinctly American, even though most of it was still coming from across the pond. So all of these factors led to the birth of the modern funeral industry in the United States. There was a shift from undertaker to the mortician. People no longer looked to the cabinet maker and grave digger, but the modern mortician needed anatomical knowledge and as well as an understanding in chemistry in order to do embalming. Training in school became required in the United States. You couldn't just decide to become a funeral director and learn embalming as a trade like you could previously. Universities and schools started offering mortuary science so people could pursue these degrees. There was a big financial shift in funerals and the way death was presented and dealt with. Places that you were buried, for example. In Boston, there are some beautiful cemetery parks, as they're called. They're designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, where they are landscaping architecture. They're specifically designed down to the last bush for everything, and manicured and manufactured to make it a pleasant place for people to visit. And have picnics and everything. But of course, the impoverished or poor couldn't afford to be buried in those types of locations. There were no more family plots or small town graveyards. There was a process you had to follow and procedures you had to go through when someone died. You couldn't just bury grandma in the backyard with everybody else anymore. There were sprawling expanses of land solely dedicated to the burial of dead, because this was the first time people had to make these mass graves in American history. Having commemorative mourning photos taken was something that only the wealthy could afford, either post-mortem or not. This is just another aspect of mourning culture that was reserved for the upper class. The funeral industry, speaking of money, the funeral industry today promotes the whole idea of dignity by upcharging for every service, which oftentimes is not necessary at all for the purposes of burial. For example, like gaskets on caskets, to make them airtight, and putting concrete plots into the ground before putting a casket in a cemetery to make sure that the ground is even and flat and manicured and remains perfect to particular standards. Embalming was used. Embalming became a tool to make people have a more pleasant experience with death. You no longer had to confront it head on, and you didn't have to deal with decomposition by creating these sleeping corpses. And that ties in the whole beautification, sterilization that we've talked about a couple times so far. Of course, no scientific advancement, however, comes without cost, and usually that cost is on marginalized groups. Many advancements in the name of science are at the expense of marginalized groups. So Black populations, for example, were rife with distrust from medical professionals. The most notable example of this leading up to the Civil War were a group of slaves that were tested on. Because they were viewed as property, they were used as unwilling and non-consenting subjects in medical testing. J. Marion Sims, a surgeon celebrated by many as the father of modern gynecology, committed despicable experiments without anesthesia on Black people in 1845. So about 20 years before the Civil War started. Medical treatment biases can still be seen today as well in the United States. A notable example is of Black mothers versus white mothers in childbirth. Per 100,000 live births in between 2007 to 2016, 41 Black people died versus the 13 white. So it is something that Black people in the United States are still struggling with, and most of the world probably already knows about all of the racial strife in the United States. It is also difficult to compare a lot of the experiences of Black people at this time versus white people. I tried to find information of the number of funeral homes operated and owned by Black people. I tried to find more Black embalmers, but all I could find was Prince Greer. I tried to find information about the disparities of income among Black families after the Civil War and white families, but there just simply isn't any recorded information about it. People just didn't find it necessary, and by people I mean the white Americans didn't find it necessary to record this information. And segregation and discrimination would continue on and keeps going up through our history, and it's still something that America is very struggling with. However, even with the arrival of modern funerary practices, Black people were able to make their own funeral homes and offered services to their own communities. It was something that everyone was able to learn and get a job in, and then create their own practices. And they did very well. Some white funeral homes even made areas to cater to Black clients in direct competition to Black-owned funeral homes, but the Black funeral homes were usually okay. Cemeteries of Black people, for example, in this time period have been bulldozed over and built over in the United States. Those that weren't are overgrown and abandoned, again, compared to the manicured, beautiful, picturesque lawns of white bodies. White people were also given memorials and statues, while the Black people who served were not, and the Indigenous people who served. Another point about the use of cadavers and bodies, not necessarily people of color, but impoverished groups. For example, body snatchers in Edinburgh, Burke and Hare, straight up murdered people for profiteering off of medical advancement and death. And in the United States, a bunch of cadavers that were used included prisoners and the unclaimed, which isn't great because like everyone needs to be able to have their own autonomy and choice over their own body, especially after death as well. So thankfully, in the United States, you can have that choice today. The scientific need for cadavers, unlike ages past where people were not given the choice, today you can donate your body to science. But I want to clarify that more often than not, your body is not being sent to medical school for anatomy study. In Stiff, The Curious Lives for Human Cadavers by Mary Roach, she goes into great detail about some of the most common use of cadavers. I do not recommend this book for the lighthearted, as some of the uses include detailed descriptions of cadavers being used in ballistics testing or as crash dummies. Or sometimes your body just gets sent to a body farm till people can watch it decompose. Those are some of the ways that your body will be used if you donate it to science. So make sure you're aware and understand where it might go after death. Sometimes people get confused about if embalming is required in modern day funeral services, and it is not. What happens to your remains after your death are entirely up to you within the laws and regulations of your country. The funeral industry has become so capitalist in nature that encouraging or sometimes lying about the need of embalming to confuse their patrons. You do not need to be embalmed. Some will recommend it if you would like an open casket funeral or viewing, but it is not necessary. As I mentioned before, we have refrigeration. I personally will not get embalmed. I would like to be dead and decomposing back into the earth. And one of the other big arguments against embalming is the environmental impact. We already talked about the arsenic, which is still affecting people today, but formaldehyde is still in use and has been since it was discovered in the late 1860s. It really hasn't changed much in the past 100 or 150 years or so. There's generally a mixture of formaldehyde, methanol, humectants, and wetting agents, but the main ingredient is formaldehyde. And while the embalming fluid delays decomposition, it does not stop or prevent it, meaning the formaldehyde and all those other yummy chemicals and carcinogens are still getting seeped into the soil and into water supplies. That being said, the United States puts small traces of formaldehyde into processed food, so do with that information as you will. According to Mary Woodson of Cornell University and Green Springs Natural Preserve in Newfield, New York, in 2001, burials in the United States used approximately 4.3 million gallons of embalming fluid, and 827,060 gallons of that was formaldehyde. I am personally a big fan of green burials and other low impact options like alkaline hydrolysis, otherwise known as aquamation, and of human composting. Finally, we have a chart here that just sort of shows like what people do with their bodies after death. This statistic is from 2021. It is from the National Funeral Directors Association. And 57.5% of people opted for cremation, which is also terrible for the environment, but that is another thing. And then 36.6% of people opted for burial. They did not go into detail about how many of those people were embalmed and then buried, or how many of those people opted for green burial or just burial without embalming. I can't imagine why the Funeral Directors Association would withhold that type of information, but there's also a 5.9% that they did not specify at all. So I can make guesses that that would be aquamation or human composting or other zany ideas people have, maybe, who knows. But with that, that is the end of my presentation. I know that there was a whirlwind of information and it was very hard to concise it all into one presentation, but I appreciate you guys sticking it out. I do have to say that this presentation template was created by SlideSgo, including icons from slide.com and infographics and images from FuPic. Blah, blah, blah. Some further reading if you're interested. There are some specific books about the Civil War dead specifically, and then some other just regarding embalming or the use of cadavers in general. And here are my sources cited for a lot of the information used in this presentation. So now we have time for questions.